Sarah Mitchell stepped off the red double-decker bus at the corner of Constitution Hill and felt her heart racing with excitement. The cool London morning air filled her lungs as she pulled her camera bag tighter across her shoulder. She had been dreaming about this moment for 3 whole years. Ever since she saw a documentary about the British royal family on television back in her small hometown of Cedar Falls, Ohio, she knew she had to see Buckingham Palace with her own eyes. The 28-year-old marketing manager had worked extra hours at her job for months to save enough money for this trip. She had eaten packed lunches instead of buying food at restaurants. She had canceled her Netflix subscription and stopped buying coffee from the fancy shop near her office. Every penny she saved went into a glass jar on her kitchen counter labeled London Fund in big black letters. Her friends thought she was crazy to spend so much money just to see some old building and fancy guards, but Sarah knew this was something she had to do. As she walked down the wide sidewalk toward the palace, Sarah pulled out her phone to check the time. It was 10:30 in the morning, which meant she had plenty of time to find the perfect spot to watch the changing of the guard ceremony. She had read online that the ceremony happened at 11 o'clock and that tourists needed to arrive early to get a good view. The streets were already crowded with people from all over the world speaking different languages and taking pictures of everything they saw. Sarah noticed a family from Japan taking selfies in front of a red phone booth. An elderly couple from Germany was studying a map and pointing in different directions. 2 young men who sounded like they were from Australia were laughing loudly and making jokes about the cloudy weather. Everyone seemed happy and excited to be there, just like Sarah felt inside her chest. The first glimpse of Buckingham Palace took Sarah's breath away. The massive cream-colored building stretched out before her like something from a fairy tale. The gold decorations on the fence sparkled in the morning light. The famous balcony where the royal family appeared for special occasions looked exactly like it did in all the pictures she had seen, but somehow more real and impressive in person. Sarah found herself walking slower as she approached the main gates. She wanted to take in every detail and remember this moment forever. The black iron fence was decorated with gold crowns and intricate patterns that must have taken skilled workers months to create. Behind the fence she could see perfectly manicured gardens with flowers arranged in neat rows and hedges, trimmed into perfect shapes. Other tourists were already gathering along the fence taking pictures and videos. Sarah noticed that some people had small folding chairs and others had brought snacks and water bottles. A tour guide with a bright yellow umbrella was explaining something to a group of about 20 people who were all wearing matching blue hats. Sarah wished she had thought to join a tour group, but she preferred to explore on her own and discover things at her own pace. She walked along the fence looking for the best spot to watch the ceremony. Near the main entrance, she saw barriers set up with thick red ropes stretched between metal posts. Signs in English and several other languages warned visitors to stay behind the barriers at all times. Sarah read one of the signs carefully. It explained that crossing the barriers was strictly forbidden, and that anyone who did so would be removed from the area immediately. The crowd was getting thicker as more tourists arrived. Sarah found herself standing next to a woman with gray hair who was wearing a Union Jack sweater and holding a small British flag. The woman smiled at Sarah and said in a friendly voice that she was from Manchester and had been coming to watch the changing of the guard for over 15 years. She told Sarah that she never got tired of seeing the ceremony because it was different every time. An American family with 3 young children squeezed in beside them. The father was trying to lift his smallest daughter onto his shoulder so she could see better. The mother was checking her camera settings and complaining that the sun was too bright. The children were asking dozens of questions about when the guards would come and whether they would be able to see the Queen. Sarah pulled out her own camera and started taking pictures of the palace and the gathering crowd. Through her camera lens, everything looked even more magical. She took shots of the Golden Gate decorations and the Red Guards boxes that stood empty near the entrance. She photographed the tourists from different countries, and the way the morning light hit the palace windows. As she was adjusting her camera settings, Sarah heard the sound of drums in the distance. The crowd around her started to buzz with excitement. People began pushing forward, trying to get closer to the barriers. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, and everyone started pointing their cameras and phones toward the sound of the music. The drumming got louder and more clear. Sarah could now hear the sound of marching feet keeping perfect time with the drums. Her heart started beating faster as she realized the ceremony was about to begin. She checked her camera one more time to make sure it was ready and positioned. Herself as close to the barrier as possible, the woman from Manchester leaned over and whispered to Sarah that the guards would be coming around the corner any minute now. She explained that they always marched in perfect formation and that their uniforms were incredibly detailed and beautiful. She warned Sarah to be ready because they moved quickly and the best photo opportunities only lasted for a few seconds. Sarah took a deep breath and felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness wash over her. She had traveled thousands of miles for this moment, and she was determined to make it count. She gripped her camera tightly and watched the corner where the guards would appear, knowing that her London adventure was about to reach its most exciting moment. The sound of marching feet grew louder and more rhythmic as Sarah pressed herself against the red rope barrier. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her camera ready, waiting for the first glimpse of the famous royal guards. The crowd around her had grown to over 200 people, all pushing gently forward, trying to get the best view possible. Children were crying with excitement, and adults were whispering in hushed tones about what they were about to witness. Then suddenly around the corner they appeared. Sarah gasped out loud as she saw the first line of guards marching in perfect synchronization. Their tall black bearskin hats stood at least 18 inches high, making them look like giants walking in formation. The bright red tunics with gold buttons and braiding caught the morning sunlight, creating a dazzling display of color and tradition. Their black boots hit the pavement with such precision that it sounded like one single footstep multiplied by 20. Sarah began taking pictures, frantically trying to capture every detail of the magnificent spectacle. The guards' faces were serious and focused straight ahead, as if they were looking at something far beyond the crowd of tourists. Their white gloves held their rifles at exactly the same angle, and their movements were so coordinated that they seemed to move as one single unit rather than individual people. Behind the first group came another line of guards, followed by a military band playing traditional British marching music. The brass instruments gleamed in the sunlight, and the drummers kept perfect time with their steady beating. Sarah had never heard music sound so powerful and official. It made her feel like she was witnessing something truly important and historic. The woman from Manchester, standing next to Sarah, pointed excitedly at one particular guard who was marching closest to their section of the barrier. He was tall and young, looking with sharp features visible beneath the shadow of his enormous hat. His posture was absolutely perfect, with his chin held high and his shoulders square. Sarah aimed her camera directly at him and began taking photo after photo. As the guards marched past, Sarah noticed something fascinating about the way they moved. Each step was exactly the same length, and their arms swung in perfect rhythm. They never looked left or right, never acknowledged the crowd that was cheering and taking pictures of them. It was as if they existed in their own world, where only their duty and their mission mattered. The ceremony continued as the guards reached the main gates of Buckingham Palace. Sarah watched in amazement as they performed a complex series of movements that had been perfected over hundreds of years. They turned in unison, stopped in formation, and began the process of changing positions with the guards who had been standing watch at the palace. Sarah found herself becoming more and more fascinated by the guard who had caught her attention earlier. He stood perfectly still now, just a few feet away from where she was positioned behind the barrier. His face was like a statue, showing no emotion or reaction to anything happening around him. Sarah had heard stories about how these guards were trained to remain motionless no matter what tourists did to try to get their attention. The American family next to Sarah was trying everything they could think of to make the guards react. The father was making funny faces, and the children were waving their hands and calling out hello to the guards. The mother was taking videos and laughing at her family's silly behavior. But the guards never moved, never smiled, never even blinked in response to any of it. Sarah became curious about just how disciplined these guards really were. She had read online that they underwent months of intense training to learn how to ignore distractions and maintain their composure under any circumstances. Some websites claim that guards had stood perfectly still even when tourists threw things at them or made loud noises right next to their ears. She decided to test this theory in a small way. Sarah began waving her hand slowly in front of her camera as if she was trying to get the perfect shot, but really she was waving at the guard to see if he would notice. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead as if she did not exist at all. This made Sarah even more curious about the limits of his training and self-control. Other tourists around her began to notice what Sarah was doing. A group of teenagers from France started giggling and pointing at her attempts to get the guards' attention. An elderly man from Scotland shook his head and muttered something about tourists having no respect for tradition. But Sarah was too fascinated to care about what other people thought. She pulled out her phone and started recording a video while making small gestures toward the guard. She spoke quietly to her camera, explaining what she was doing for her travel blog back home. She described how incredible it was to see someone with such perfect discipline and self-control. She wondered out loud what it would take to make one of these guards break character, even for just a second. The guard continued to stand motionless, even as Sarah moved closer to the barrier. His breathing was so controlled that Sarah could barely see his chest moving up and down. His eyes never shifted from their fixed position, staring straight ahead. His hands remained perfectly positioned on his rifle, and his feet stayed planted in exactly the same spot. Sarah began to feel a strange mix of admiration and challenge building up inside her chest. She respected the guard's incredible discipline, but at the same time she felt almost compelled to see if there was any way to get some kind of human reaction from him. It was like looking at a perfectly painted statue and wondering if there was a real person inside. The ceremony was starting to wind down, and Sarah realized that soon the guards would march away and her opportunity would be over. She had come all this way and spent so much money to experience something unique and memorable. Looking at the stoic guard standing so close to her, Sarah began to wonder if she should try something a little more bold to create a truly unforgettable moment. For her trip to London, Sarah felt her heart beating faster as she stared at the motionless guard standing just a few feet away from her. The main ceremony had ended, but several guards remained at their posts around the palace gates. Most of the tourists were starting to walk away, taking final pictures and chatting excitedly about what they had just witnessed. But Sarah could not bring herself to leave. She was completely fascinated by the young guard who continued to stand like a perfect statue. The guard appeared to be in his early 20s with a strong jawline and serious expression. His red uniform was immaculate without a single wrinkle or spot of dirt. The gold braiding on his jacket caught the light every time he took a breath. His tall black bearskin hat added an air of ancient tradition and ceremony to his already impressive appearance. Sarah had never seen anyone display such incredible self-discipline and control. She decided to try a more direct approach to test his resolve. Sarah moved as close to the red rope barrier as possible and began making exaggerated facial expressions. She raised her eyebrows high, opened her mouth wide, and made silly, surprised faces, hoping to catch his attention. The guard's eyes remained fixed on some invisible point in the distance, completely ignoring her antics. A small group of tourists noticed what Sarah was doing and began to gather around her. A middle-aged couple from Canada started laughing and taking pictures of Sarah's performance. 2 college students from Australia pulled out their phones and began recording videos. Soon Sarah had an audience of about 15 people, who were encouraging her efforts and clearly enjoying the entertainment. Feeling emboldened by the attention, Sarah decided to escalate her attempts. She began doing a little dance behind the barrier, swaying back and forth and moving her arms in dramatic gestures. She made funny noises and tried different voices as if she were performing in a comedy show. The small crowd around her grew larger and more animated as tourists stopped to see what was causing all the laughter and excitement. the guard remained completely unmoved by Sarah's increasingly elaborate performance. His breathing stayed perfectly controlled and his posture never shifted even slightly. It was as if he had turned himself into an actual statue made of stone and metal. Sarah found this both impressive and frustrating at the same time. She had never encountered anyone with such incredible mental strength and focus. Sarah pulled out her phone and began narrating her actions for a video she planned to post on her social media accounts back home. She spoke directly to the camera, explaining that she was trying to see if the famous British Royal Guards really were as disciplined as everyone claimed. She described the guards' perfect posture and unwavering concentration while continuing to make gestures and faces in his direction. The crowd around Sarah continued to grow as more tourists stopped to watch her impromptu performance. Some people were taking pictures of her while others were filming videos of their own. A few tourists began making suggestions about what Sarah should try next to get the guards' attention. Someone called out that she should try singing a song. Another person suggested she should do jumping jacks or pretend to be a robot. Sarah was beginning to feel like she was the star of her own travel show. The attention from other tourists was exciting, and she felt a rush of adrenaline as more people joined her audience. She began incorporating some of their suggestions into her routine, jumping up and down and making robot movements with her arms. She tried singing a popular song from back home, but the guard showed no reaction whatsoever. As her performance continued, Sarah noticed that some of the other guards stationed around the palace were also maintaining their perfect stillness despite the growing commotion. It seemed like nothing could break their concentration or cause them to acknowledge the tourists in any way. This made Sarah even more determined to find some way to get a reaction from at least one of them. She decided to try a different approach and began telling jokes out loud, hoping that humor might be the key to cracking their serious exterior. She told funny stories about her trip to London and made jokes about the differences between American and British culture. Her audience laughed appreciatively at her commentary, but the guards remained as motionless as ever. Sarah then tried making animal sounds, thinking that something unexpected might catch the guard off guard. She mooed like a cow, barked like a dog, and made chirping noises like a bird. The tourists around her were now laughing so hard that some of them had tears in their eyes. But the guard's expression never changed, and his eyes never wavered from their fixed position. The whole situation was becoming more and more surreal as Sarah's simple attempt to get a guard's attention had turned into a full-scale entertainment show for dozens of tourists. People were calling out encouragement and suggestions while taking countless pictures and videos. Sarah felt like she was becoming famous right there on the sidewalk in front of Buckingham Palace, but despite all her efforts and creativity, the guard remained completely unresponsive. His training was clearly more thorough and effective than Sarah had imagined possible. She began to realize that these guards were not just ceremonial figures in fancy uniforms, but highly trained professionals who took their duties very seriously. As Sarah paused to catch her breath and think about what to try next, she noticed that her audience had grown to over 40 people. Some tourists were starting to form a second row behind the first group of spectators. The energy in the crowd was building, and Sarah could feel their expectations growing. They wanted to see if she could accomplish what seemed impossible too: make one of the famous royal guards break character. Sarah looked back at the stoic guard and felt a new surge of determination. She had come too far and gathered too much attention to give up now. She began planning her next move, something that would be bold enough to finally get some kind of reaction from the impressively disciplined young man in the red uniform. Sarah looked around at the crowd of tourists who were now completely focused on her performance. Their faces showed excitement and anticipation as they waited to see what she would do next. The energy in the air was electric, and Sarah felt like she was standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people. She had never experienced anything like this before, and the thrill was both exciting and a little overwhelming. The guard continued to stand perfectly still, showing no sign that he was even aware of the growing commotion happening just a few feet away from him. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, and his breathing was so controlled that Sarah could barely detect any movement in his chest. The red uniform looked even more impressive up close, and Sarah could see the incredible attention to detail in every button and piece of braiding. Sarah decided that it was time to take her efforts to the next level. She had tried making faces, telling jokes, and doing dances, but nothing had worked so far. She needed to do something more dramatic and attention-grabbing if she wanted to finally get some kind of reaction from the stoic guard. She looked around at her audience and announced loudly that she was going to try something really special. The crowd pressed closer to the barrier, eager to see what Sarah had planned. Some people were holding their phones high above their heads to get better video angles. Others were calling out suggestions and encouragement. A few tourists were even taking bets on whether Sarah would be successful in making the guard react to her antics. Sarah reached into her travel bag and pulled out a small rubber chicken that she had bought as a souvenir from a gift shop earlier that morning. The bright yellow toy made a loud squeaking sound when she pressed it, and Sarah thought it might be just the thing to surprise the guard. She held it up for the crowd to see, and everyone began laughing and cheering at her creative prop choice. She positioned herself directly in front of the guard and began squeezing the rubber chicken, repeatedly making it squeak loudly right next to his ear. The sound was sharp and unexpected, but the guard did not even blink or turn his head slightly toward the noise. Sarah moved the chicken closer to his face, squeezing it over and over while making exaggerated chicken sounds with her own voice. The crowd was now laughing so hard that some people were doubled over, holding their stomachs. The rubber chicken performance was unlike anything they had ever seen at a tourist attraction, and many people were recording every moment to share with friends and family back home. Sarah felt like a professional comedian as she continued her chicken-themed routine, but even the ridiculous rubber chicken failed to get any response from the incredibly disciplined guard. Sarah began to realize just how thorough his training must have been to allow him to ignore such an unusual and noisy distraction. She wondered what kind of preparation these guards went through and how they learned to maintain such perfect composure under any circumstances. Not willing to give up, Sarah decided to combine the rubber chicken with some physical comedy. She began doing an elaborate chicken dance around the barrier, flapping her arms like wings and making clucking sounds while continuing to squeeze the toy. She strutted back and forth in front of the guard, pecking at imaginary food on the ground and ruffling her feathers like a real chicken. The performance was so entertaining that tourists who had been walking past the palace stopped to join the growing audience. Word was spreading through the crowd that an American woman was putting on an amazing show trying to make a royal guard break character. People were pulling out their cameras and phones to capture the spectacle for themselves. Sarah noticed that her audience now included people from many different countries and age groups. There were families with small children, elderly couples on vacation, and groups of young travelers backpacking through Europe. Everyone seemed to be enjoying her performance, and the positive energy from the crowd gave Sarah even more confidence to continue pushing the boundaries. She decided to add some dramatic storytelling to her chicken routine. Sarah began narrating an elaborate tale about a brave chicken who traveled from America to England to meet the Queen. She used different voices for different characters and made the story as silly and entertaining as possible while continuing to dance around with the rubber chicken. The guard remained completely motionless throughout Sarah's entire performance. His eyes never shifted from their fixed position, and his facial expression never changed even slightly. It was becoming clear to Sarah and everyone watching that his level of self-discipline was truly extraordinary. Most people would have at least smiled or shown some small reaction to such an unusual and entertaining display. Sarah began to feel a mix of admiration and frustration building inside her chest. She respected the guard's incredible professionalism and dedication to his duties, but at the same time she felt challenged by his complete lack of response to her efforts. She had put on what she considered to be an amazing performance, and yet it was as if she were completely invisible to him. The crowd was still cheering and encouraging Sarah to continue, but she could sense that some people were starting to wonder if anything would ever make the guard react. A few tourists began making comments about how impressive the guard's training was and how dedicated he must be to his job. Others were starting to suggest that maybe Sarah should try something even more dramatic. Sarah looked at the rubber chicken in her hand and then back at the stoic guard standing just a few feet away. She realized that her simple tourist adventure was turning into something much bigger and more significant. She was no longer just trying to get a photo or create a memory for her travel blog. She was now engaged in what felt like a serious test of wills between herself and one of the most disciplined soldiers in the world. The moment had arrived for Sarah to make a decision that would determine how far she was willing to go in her quest to get some kind of reaction from the Royal Guard. Sarah stood there holding the rubber chicken and staring at the guard, who continued to show absolutely no reaction to anything she had done. The crowd behind her was still buzzing with excitement, but Sarah could feel something changing inside herself. What had started as innocent fun was now becoming something more serious, and she was not sure how far she should push the situation. The guard looked so young and professional, standing there in his perfect red uniform. Sarah began to wonder about his life outside of this job. Did he have a family waiting for him at home? Did he enjoy movies or sports or hanging out with friends like any other person his age? It seemed almost impossible that someone could have such incredible self-control and discipline at such a young age, but the thrill of the moment and the energy from the crowd was too strong for Sarah to resist. She had traveled thousands of miles to create unforgettable memories, and she felt like she was on the verge of doing something truly remarkable. The tourists around her were taking pictures and videos that would be shared all over the world on social media. She was becoming part of London tourism history right before her eyes. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She looked around to make sure no security guards were watching closely, then she took a deep breath and stepped forward. In one quick movement, she ducked under the red rope barrier that separated the tourists from the guards. The crowd behind her gasped in surprise and excitement as they realized what she had just done. Now, Sarah was standing in the restricted area just a few feet away from the guard. She could see his face much more clearly and noticed details about his uniform that were not visible from behind the barrier. The gold braiding on his jacket was even more intricate up close, and she could see that his boots were polished to an absolutely perfect shine. Every single detail of his appearance was flawless. The guard did not move or react, even though Sarah had clearly crossed into an area where tourists were not allowed to go. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, and his breathing stayed perfectly controlled. Sarah was amazed that he could maintain such composure even when someone had obviously broken the rules and entered his personal space. The crowd behind the barrier was now completely silent, watching to see what would happen next. Some people looked worried about what Sarah had done, while others seemed excited to see how far she would take her bold adventure. Everyone had their cameras ready, knowing that they were witnessing something that very few tourists had ever attempted. Before Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized the significance of what she had just done. She was now standing in a place where she was definitely not supposed to be face to face with one of the most famous guards in the world. The adrenaline rush was incredible, but she also felt a small voice in the back of her mind warning her that she might be taking things too far. She decided to test the guard's reaction to her presence in the restricted area. Sarah began waving the rubber chicken directly in front of his face, moving it back and forth just inches from his nose. She squeezed it repeatedly, making loud, squeaking sounds while watching carefully for any sign that he was aware of what she was doing. The guard continued to stare straight ahead as if Sarah did not exist at all. His eyes never followed the movement of the rubber chicken, and his facial expression remained completely neutral. Sarah had never seen such incredible mental strength and focus in her entire life. It was like he had trained himself to become immune to any kind of distraction or disruption. Sarah then tried talking directly to the guard in a normal, conversational voice. She told him her name and explained that she had come all the way from Ohio to see the famous ceremony. She complimented his uniform and asked if he enjoyed his job protecting the palace. She spoke as if they were old friends meeting for coffee, completely ignoring the fact that he was not responding to anything she said. The silence from the guard was both impressive and slightly unsettling. Sarah had never had a conversation with someone who refused to acknowledge her presence in any way. She began to understand that this was not just about having good manners or following rules. This was about a level of professional discipline that most people could never achieve. Sarah noticed that other guards stationed around the palace area were also maintaining their positions without any reaction to the unusual situation happening. Nearby, it seemed like they were all trained to ignore distractions and continue their duties no matter what kind of chaos might be happening around them. This level of coordination and professionalism was truly remarkable. The crowd behind the barrier was getting larger as more tourists arrived and saw the spectacle taking place. People were pointing and whispering to each other about the American woman who had crossed the line to get closer to the guard. Some tourists were taking pictures of the growing audience as much as they were photographing Sarah, and the guard. Sarah began to feel the weight of all the attention focused on her. She realized that her actions were being recorded by dozens of people and that videos of this moment would probably be posted online within hours. She wondered what people back home would think when they saw what she had done during her London vacation. The guard remained perfectly still even though Sarah was now standing close enough to reach out and touch his uniform. His breathing was so controlled that she could barely see his chest moving up and down. His hands stayed in exactly the same position on his rifle, and his feet remained planted firmly in place as if they were rooted to the ground. Sarah looked at the rubber chicken in her hand and then back at the guard's stoic face. She realized that she had reached a critical moment in her adventure. She had crossed the barrier and gotten closer to a royal guard than probably any tourist before her, but she still had not achieved her goal of getting any kind of reaction from him. The question now was whether she should be satisfied with what she had accomplished, or push even further into uncharted territory. Sarah stood in the restricted area holding her breath as she watched the guard's face for any sign of reaction. The crowd behind the barrier had grown to over 100 people, and the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something dramatic to happen, but nobody knew exactly what that might be. Sarah felt like she was balanced on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether she should step back to safety or jump into the unknown. Suddenly, without any warning, the guard moved. It happened so quickly that Sarah barely had time to process what was occurring. The guard, who had been standing perfectly still like a statue for the entire time Sarah had been performing, suddenly executed a sharp, precise military turn. His movement was so swift and authoritative that Sarah stumbled backward in complete shock and surprise. The crowd behind the barrier fell completely silent. The laughter and cheering that had been constant for the past 30 minutes stopped instantly as everyone realized that something serious was happening. Parents pulled their children closer and tourists lowered their cameras as the mood shifted from entertainment to concern. In just a few seconds, the guard began marching directly toward Sarah with the same perfect military precision that she had admired during the ceremony. His boots clicked against the pavement with a rhythmic sound that seemed to echo off the palace walls. Each step was measured and deliberate, and Sarah could see the serious expression on his face as he approached her position. Sarah felt her confidence drain away as she realized that her fun tourist adventure had suddenly become something much more serious. The guard was no longer ignoring her presence. Instead, he was focused directly on her with an intensity that made her feel small and foolish. She looked around desperately for some way to escape the situation, but she was surrounded by barriers and crowds of people. When the guard reached Sarah, he stopped just a few feet away from her and spoke in a clear, commanding voice that carried across the entire courtyard. His tone was professional and authoritative without any hint of anger or amusement. Every word he spoke was precise and measured as if he had rehearsed this moment many times before. The guard told Sarah that she needed to step back behind the barrier immediately. He explained that her actions had violated multiple security protocols and that she was in an area that was strictly forbidden to all tourists and visitors. His voice was calm but firm, and Sarah could tell that he was completely serious about what he was saying. Sarah tried to apologize. and explained that she had meant no harm, but the guard continued speaking without acknowledging her attempts to defend herself. He told her that while she might think her behavior was entertaining, the guards were active duty soldiers with real responsibilities. They were not performers or tourist attractions, but trained professionals protecting one of the most important buildings in the United Kingdom. The guard explained that every person who approached the restricted area was evaluated as a potential security threat. Sarah's actions, no matter how innocent they might have seemed, had triggered multiple security protocols that were designed to protect the palace and everyone in the surrounding area. He told her that guards and security personnel had been watching her behavior and assessing the situation from the moment she first crossed the barrier. Sarah looked around and noticed for the first time that other guards had quietly moved into strategic positions around the courtyard. She could also see security personnel in civilian clothes positioned throughout the crowd of tourists. She realized that her simple attempt to get a guard's attention had created a security situation that involved many more people than she had ever imagined. The guard continued his explanation, telling Sarah that the months of training that royal guards underwent was not just about learning to stand still and look impressive. They learned to assess threats, maintain security, and protect the monarchy while dealing with thousands of tourists every single day. Their ability to ignore distractions was not a party trick, but an essential part of their professional duties. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she understood the seriousness of what she had done. She had thought she was just having fun and creating entertaining content for her social media accounts. She had not considered that her actions might be seen as disrespectful or potentially threatening by the people whose job it was to maintain security at the palace. Then something completely unexpected happened that shocked Sarah and everyone watching. After explaining the seriousness of his duties and the importance of security protocols, the guard looked directly at Sarah with an expression that was much softer than before. His voice became more gentle and understanding as he continued speaking. The guard told Sarah that he could see she was genuinely curious about their traditions and that her enthusiasm, while misguided, came from a place of appreciation for British culture. He said that many tourists made similar mistakes because they did not understand the real purpose and importance of the Royal Guard's role at the palace. To Sarah's complete amazement, the guard then did something that made the entire crowd gasp in surprise. He gave her a small respectful nod and allowed a brief but genuine smile to cross his face. It was just for a moment, but it completely transformed his appearance from a stone-faced soldier to a kind young man who understood that Sarah had made an honest mistake. The guard suggested that if Sarah wanted to learn more about the changing of the guard ceremony and the history of the Royal Guards, there were official tours available that could provide her with fascinating information without compromising security or breaking any rules. He told her that these tours would give her a much better understanding of the traditions and responsibilities that made the guards so dedicated to their duties. Sarah was so moved by the guards' unexpected kindness and professionalism that she began crying with relief and gratitude. She apologized sincerely for her behavior and thanked him for his patience and understanding. She promised that she would never again do anything that might interfere with the important work that he and his fellow guards were doing. As the guard returned to his position, the crowd of tourists erupted into spontaneous applause. But they were not clapping for Sarah's entertaining performance. They were applauding the guard's incredible display of professionalism, dignity, and compassion. Sarah left Buckingham Palace that day with a story that was far more meaningful than any photograph could have captured, and a deep respect for the dedication and humanity of the Royal Guards.